Finally, tonight, we remember the prolific writer and Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Philip Roth. He died yesterday of congestive heart failure at the age of 85. Roth was the author of more than 25 books and a giant in American literature. His work evolved through several distinct phases and often featured Roth's fictional alter egos, including his best-known character, Nathan Zuckerman. The 1969 novel Portnoy's Complaint rocketed him to fame for its raunchy, hilarious depiction of a teenage boy's lustful urges and ensuing guilt. Roth would later focus more deeply on Jewish life, mortality, and American history, often setting his novels in Newark, New Jersey, where Roth grew up. During a particularly fruitful period in his 60s, Roth returned to a number of those themes. The accolades and the novels came quickly, including American Pastoral, I Married a Communist, and The Plot Against America. In a moment, William Brangham talks with a colleague and collaborator of Roth's. But first, how Roth himself saw his work. Jeffrey Brown had the chance to sit down with him for a rare interview back in 2004. Here are some excerpts.
What is it that you want to do when you start a novel? What are you trying to do?
Get to work.
Get to work.
Get to work. Work. Without a novel, I'm empty. I'm empty and not very happy. So when I get to work on a novel, I begin to do what I'm supposed to do. It's a long process. Usually it takes between 2 and 3 years to write a novel for me. I don't think about the reader. I think about the book. I think about the sentence. I think about the paragraph. I think about the page. I go over it and over it and over it. The book begins to make its demands. The demands are intellectual, they're imaginative, they're aesthetic.
It's interesting because you're often described as something of a provocateur, sort of throwing out literary bombshells, and you get a lot of reaction to your work.
I'm a very bad judge of how people will respond to my work, how the general reader will respond to a book. And I'm always surprised by the responses that a book elicits.
Many observers have noted this great run of books that you've had over the last, say, 10 years or so. What happened?
What did I eat for breakfast, you mean? I don't know. Maybe it's a consequence of age. But I did feel energetic, and I did feel ambitious, and I did the work.
What was your ambition to do?
To be able to write this kind of book. To be able to broaden the subject, while at the same time keeping it a novel, while at the same time having the subject enacted by people.
And broaden the subject. What is the subject?
When I came back to live in America in 1989 all the time, I felt enormously energized by being home. But also, I realized that I had in front of me a new subject that was an old subject, which was this country. That it was brand new to me in a strange way, yet I knew all about it because I had been brought up here. So being away for 10 or 12 years produced, I think, a burst of writing energy.
And when you think about now, do you see a different writer, a better writer, a worse writer?
Well, I like to think a better writer. A different writer, sure. You begin with, or I began certainly, with enormous naivete and rawness. You're very raw when you begin. And I don't think I think I'm only half as naive now. And raw, I'm only raw from the hard work. I'm not raw in the way a young fellow would be raw.
Some years ago, I know you were involved with Eastern European writers at a time when they were a kind of moral voice against a totalitarian society. What do you see as your role, or as the role of a writer in our society?
Your role is to write as well as you can. You're not advancing social causes as far as I'm concerned. You're not addressing social problems. What you're advancing is, there's only one cause you're advancing, that's the cause of literature, which is one of the great lost human causes. So you do your bit. You do your bit for fiction, for the novel.
Here to talk now about Roth's life and work is Max Rudin. He's the president of Library of America, a nonprofit that preserves, publishes, and celebrates America's greatest writing. In 2005, Philip Roth became just the third living writer to have his books enshrined in the library. Rudin collaborated closely with Roth throughout the years. Max Rudin, I'm sorry for the loss of your friend, and obviously sorry for the world who doesn't get any more of Philip Roth's remarkable works. For people who are not familiar with those works, can you just explain to us what made him so special?
Well, I think the first thing to say is just the sheer verbal inventiveness and imaginative power of his work. He is, nearly unique in American letters in the number of different modes and tones he could write in. He was an amazing literary ventriloquist, from the ironic comedy of the early book Goodbye Columbus to the the outrageous kind of stand-up farce of Portnoy's Complaint, to the more tempered realism of the American trilogy books, and then the chastened elegiac tone of the later books. It's amazing that one writer could do all that. And I think, looking at his entire career as a whole, 31 books, 51 years, together it makes one of the most extraordinary literary journeys in American writing.
Just as you say, he really did at times seem like 4 or 5 writers compressed into one. I mean, he was so funny. He could write about mortality and sadness so well. I mean, he could write about his faith. He really could seem to do it all. Did you have a sense from working with him that he was aware of all of these different pots that he could dip into?
Everyone who knew him knew of his extraordinary verbal gifts. I mean, he not only had it on the page, he had it talking in person. He was extremely funny and extremely intelligent and a warm person. That's the other thing I would say about his work is that, after Portnoy especially, and Portnoy is the first great breakthrough book. I mean, Philip has a couple different breakthrough books throughout his career, but Portnoy really opens the floodgates for the first time. And this voice, comes pouring out or seems to come pouring out. It's the result of hard work, of course. And it hums, with intelligence and energy and humor on the page, and that's what makes him and that's what makes him compulsively readable. And I think that's another reason why people come back to him.
Does the evolution of his career make sense to you when you look back on it now? Because if you do look at the younger books, they really are largely about a younger man and his coming to terms with his own sexuality. Then they move into a middle-age phase, and then very later in his life, they sort of deal with a man growing old and facing his ultimate reckoning. Does that trajectory make sense to you?
It does. I mean, fundamentally, Philip was on kind of two sides at the same time. He was on the side of vitality, of libido and liberation, and it's a 60s theme. The era where his work really begins. And yet he was also a ruthlessly honest observer of the forces, the historical forces arrayed against that liberation and vitality. And I think as the work goes on, I mean, that darker side gets explored more and more. The forces of political violence in the war in Vietnam, in American Pastoral, the McCarthy era, and I Married a Communist, and the way in a certain era political correctness could be used as a bludgeon in Human Stain. He's one of the great ironists of our literature because he at once is in sympathy with the impulses of liberation and yet understands deeply the forces, as I say, that block that that liberation, the forces of fate and history.
All right, Max Ruden, the Library of America, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for asking me.